Wilson, Professor Matt Wilson, also from Brain and Cognitive Sciences, and Professor Nicholas Roy from CSAIL at MIT. So the topic for the panel discussion today is there anything special about human intelligence? So I was envisioning that this question may take a number of different directions and formats, including what's particularly amazing about biological intelligence versus what machines can do these days, but also discussions about how do we go about studying intelligence in non-human animals, and what are the differences between non-human animals and human intelligence as well. And then generally speaking, what are the directions that we should take in AI to learn from the incredible resources and opportunities that we have from studying both cognition in humans as well as detailed neural circuits in animal models. So without further ado.
I pondered the question, anything special about human intelligence? My first thought was that special is kind of a funny word, and that I wasn't quite sure how to interpret special. So one thing that is clear is that there's lots of things that human intelligence can do that machines can't do at all, or at least can't easily do. And so I thought through a few of these things, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, and it's easy to argue about whether or not machines can do them or how easily can do them. But certainly, humans seem to be at least much better at learning from very, very small numbers of examples in a way that like robots and computers seem to require a lot of data. Another thing is that machines, at least our best performing machines, seem to be hobbled by the ability to generalize outside the training set. There are certainly some systems that can generalize outside the training set, but they don't tend to be our best performing systems right now at a lot of the tasks we care about, perception, et cetera. Humans certainly can reason at multiple levels of abstraction, and we actually can see in the brain, we can actually physically see the meat that if you will, that reasons at multiple levels of abstraction. And my robots do reason at different levels of abstraction, but man, it's an effort to get them to do that. And there's certainly, I think, as far as embodied intelligence is concerned, there is no principled way of articulating those different levels of abstraction and actually writing down an objective function. And one thing is that robots are phenomenally bad at recognizing risks to themselves and others and choosing actions. You can encode risk in the reward function, but that's very different from recognizing an action you might take might end your existence. Robots have and other machine intelligences have no concept of the end of their existence and what that might mean in terms of the decision making. And the flip side of that is they can't choose actions that have no apparent value. So, I and a couple of other folks have a project to actually try to understand curiosity in embodied intelligence. And it's really hard to sort of understand what is it that motivates us to learn things that have no apparent value, but oftentimes they end up telling you something's useful for the future. So these are some ways in which they're at least different. But there's no reason why machine intelligence couldn't do these things at a fundamental level. So, learning from teeny numbers of examples and generalizing outside the training set, that might very well just be a function of the inductive biases that we put inside our system. So, part of what makes neural networks really good is that they're able to use all of the representational power to capture what's inside the training set. But that's the result of an inductive bias. And so maybe we should just need to think harder about what the inductive bias is that's in human intelligence. Reasoning at multiple levels of abstraction could just be, again, a different internal representation that we just don't have, at least my robots don't have the right representation. And then the last thing is that, these choosing actions and exhibiting curiosity, they appear to just be different loss functions. Maybe fatal risk is somehow different to a loss function, but maybe the reason our robots and our machine intelligence don't have these properties is because we just haven't gotten the loss function right, and we need to understand what it is about human intelligence that's in terms of loss functions is giving us this sense. So I don't know that I can answer the question of whether or not human intelligence is special compared to machine intelligence, but I think there are some clear differences where human intelligence has desirable properties that machine intelligence doesn't have, and there's some ideas about how we might get to those. And then I'm happy to answer questions about this throughout the rest of this panel.
Very good. Thank you very much, Nick. I just want to very quickly introduce our fourth panelist, Professor Murty, who's the director of the Center for Brain Science at Harvard. And now I suggest that we go with Laura and then Matt and then Venki, and then you answer questions. So I will shut up, and now the four of you can lead the rest of the panel discussion.
Great. I didn't prepare any slides here. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I didn't prepare any slides because I was coming in to talk about this perennially fascinating question. And I think we maybe do ourselves a disservice by thinking just in terms of humans and machines, because we share the planet with vast numbers of organisms with very different kinds of intelligence, each of which is fairly unique and distinctive. And there are lots of creatures that can do lots of things that we can quite effortlessly, and things we can do that no other creature can. So I think one of the ways that it's often fruitful to think about machine intelligence is what kinds of intelligence is it exhibiting, and are the processes by which machines are learning, are they most similar to humans? Because even when they're not similar to humans, they may be capturing kinds of intelligence that are present and emergent in other species. And so I think that the broad range of intelligence is important to consider here. And of course, even the very simplest machines have long been able to do things humans can't do. Our calculators are much better than us at doing rapid calculations, for instance. That's why we invented the machines. So even a simple pocket calculator is in some ways much smarter than humans in a very, very limited way. I would agree with basically everything Nicholas said about human intelligence, but I think it goes a lot beyond that. It's not just that we are curious about useless things or that we're bad at calculating fatal risks, is that we habitually invent new problems for ourselves. We create problems we don't really have, and then we go about trying to solve them. And when we do solve them, we create new problems. And those problems themselves act as bootstraps into learning. They constrain the kinds of searches we organize. They constrain the ways we frame and think about our ideas. And we think about the value of our problems ourselves. Unlike, I think one thing that might be distinctive about humans, and this is an idea I've been playing with a lot recently, is that most animals have a very restricted set of utilities, largely governed by their survival and reproductive ends. And humans can really choose almost any arbitrary reward and incur almost any cost, including cost to life, limb, and health. And the flexibility of our utility functions is what makes us able to create all these innumerable problems, in part because every kind of goal we set and every cost we're willing to incur creates a different problem space. And those, again, impose different inductive biases, different constraints, support different avenues of learning. So I think that's very interesting. I think one of the things that is probably not desirable in our machines is that we allow them to set their own utility functions. There's a lot of reasons why we want our machines to have our utilities at stake and not invent their own. But it might be critical to human intelligence that we do have that flexibility, that we can decide what to want, that we can decide, even in very idiosyncratic ways, what goals to pursue. So I think I'll stop there and pass it on.
Yeah, great. I also didn't prepare any slides, but fortunately both Nick and Laura brought up the points that I was actually thinking about discussing, and that is sort of the idea of animal intelligence relative to human intelligence. I think the thing that about human intelligence we focus on is because we sort of think of humans as representing kind of a collective niche. I mean, we all sort of share and understand the way humans think, but as Laura points out, the thing that really strikes me about animal intelligence and and brains in general is that there are so many of them, that intelligence is manifest in so many different ways, both structurally and in terms of the environmental and behavioral constraints that drive it. But in the end, as Laura points out, it really is all about how do you survive, how do you thrive? And I don't fundamentally think that humans are really any different in that way. I think the idea that, well, humans have some way to sort of transcend the kind of immediate constraints and immediate objective functions we create problems to solve, brings up an interesting point that I think Nick pointed out, and and it was this question of risk. I was also going to bring that up. One thing that I like to think about, and just observing human behavior, is not how people are really so intelligent. I'm never really that struck by how intelligent people are. I am very struck by how stupid people are. When they do things, it's like, why is that person doing that stupid thing? Why do people take risks? And I think we fail to appreciate that intelligence, when manifest in individuals, is not just about individuals optimizing their outcomes. It's about the collective group. We need people to take risks. We need individuals to try and fail so that the group in general can succeed. We need people to take risks, and we need others not to take risks. And so I think what's difficult in embedding the kind of intelligence that organisms that work within groups and manifest that intelligence in terms of the sort of the optimal outcome of the group is that we need robots, as Nick said, not to do stupid things on an individual basis. We can't have robots take risk unless we have armies of robots that are able to, sort of collectively solve problems. And so it's sort of that conflict. How do we get robots to embody the best parts of intelligence that really objectively, when you look at animals and humans, while we can point to instances of that, in general, intelligence is kind of a distributed function. We need diversity of problem-solving abilities. And this comes in studies of, when you think about, problem-solving in groups, you think, what's the best group to really tackle a problem? Well, you think, oh, you just get all the smartest people together, right? That's how you do it. Well, actually, it turns out, no. It's about having a heterogeneous group. You need you need people or individuals or intelligences that kind of span the diversity of problem-solving approaches, not just, sort of a narrow definition of what we think of as really intelligent, really focused, optimally solving a problem. And so kind of thinking about, animals, risk-taking, sort of diversity of intelligence, and then the idea of individual versus kind of collective or group intelligence, and how we kind of incorporate what ultimately is going to be a new kind of intelligence into machines. And that is an intelligence that does not serve them, but an intelligence that serves others. And that is, serves those that would like that intelligence to somehow augment their ability to survive and thrive. And animals are smart. I mean, they do survive and they do thrive.
So I think one of the advantages of coming in last is that people make important points already, so you don't have to speak very much, but it's also obviously a disadvantage. Great points, everybody. I think I want to actually maybe think about 2 points. One of them I've been actually thinking about overnight, to the point that I even tweeted out something related to that an hour ago, which is that, I mean, is intelligence and this whole concept, is that like a scalar analog variable, or is it like something digital, right? I mean, is it like why, or is it, and maybe this is another way of phrasing what other people have said, which is like, is human intelligent, somewhere on the number line of other kinds of intelligence? Or is it somehow, digital, that we cross some threshold and therefore it's somehow unique and different? And I personally don't think so. I think for almost everything that we can think of as intelligent behavior, I think we can probably find analogs or metaphors in animals. So I think it's not clear that there's something that we have that's somehow digitally we just cross a threshold and it's just completely different from something else. So I think maybe that's the one thing that I don't know the answer, but I've been pondering about, like, how do we, language is this an obvious thing that we think somehow we're just spectacularly different, but is that true? So can we think of other communications that string together sequences of elements that resemble something like language, whether it's, widely fluent versus, more stereotyped? And I think that maybe there is. So I think perhaps we should think about things that are not just that we're somehow completely different versus that we're on the scale of everybody else, and we're just maybe we created a new axis, I don't know, new axis of intelligence along the dimension scale. And related to that, my own research, and I work on animal research, obviously, so I always think about the sense of smell, which I think about quite a lot, as something that humans, we just simply don't seem to have a very good intuition. Is that any form of intelligence? I mean, are animals that are extraordinarily good at sensing chemicals, navigating using them, and identifying them and figuring that out, is that a form of intelligence? And if so, like, how do we even think about it? Like, machines, of course, robots, we're talking about it, and there's no robot. I mean, it's all about sound and vision, right? There's no robots right now, or no embodied intelligence other than in animals that go about looking for chemicals or being intelligent about chemicals. So I think the two things, one, like, is it analog versus is it something that we just don't have a good sense of? Like, our imagination is limited by what we feel comfortable about, and that's what intelligence is. So that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you very much to all the panelists. So I want to mostly shut up here and let all four of you lead the discussion. So
sounds good. Here's one from Deborah Protim. All animals probably have a good grasping of intuitive physics and obviously some sort of intelligent communication. Do you think that the ability of grasping mathematics and language at the level of humans are correlated? Can there then be a unifying framework or software implementation that manifests as these two separate forms of intelligence?
I'm happy to kick that off a little bit because it's been a question that people have talked about a lot, especially in the developmental literature where I work, because human babies obviously start off as the sort of organisms that have some grasp of intuitive physics and some forms of intelligent communication, but don't start off with mathematics and language, but they do end up with it. And so one of the questions has been, how much do they start by sharing capacities that we share with a wide range of other organisms? And, quite a number of animals understand some basic things about mathematics. So very many animals are good at approximate number representations. They can tell roughly how many berries are in this bush, how many, prey animals there are in this field. And quite a few animals are also good at exact numbers. They can tell how many eggs are in their nest, and they will kick out an egg if you try to sneak an extra egg in there. So they can subitize very small numbers, and they can represent approximate numbers. No other animal that we know of has a count list that can actually represent that the difference between 9 and 10 is the same as the difference between 21 and 22. No other animal can really bridge these systems to do the kinds of representations and computations that humans can do. And the argument has been exactly that the symbolic abilities that are associated with language help to bridge core systems of mathematics that are present in other animals, but that in humans turn into the ability to manipulate symbols very, very richly and turn into things like the formal mathematics that we all benefit from here. So I don't know if that entirely answers the question, but yes, I think there's an idea that there is perhaps a unifying framework or software that gets culturally transmitted in humans that doesn't build mathematics from scratch, but that takes these core representations and lets us use them in much richer, much more flexible ways.
So I completely agree with everything Laura said. The one thing that I would say is that they might be this at a meta level, they might be the same thing, in that there's common operations between math and language. So there are ways in which mathematical symbols and linguistic symbols correspond to things that we perceive and we can do. They're essentially both forms of abstraction. Those abstractions, there are well-defined composition operators. You can assemble mathematical symbols together to express functions, etc. You can assemble linguistic functions together. There's a well-defined parse structure. You can have a nonsensical mathematical equation just as you can have a nonsensical linguistic sentence. And then you can abstract further. And the more and more abstract you get, the harder and harder it is for somebody who's not well-versed in that abstraction to follow. I think that the differences might be in the instantiations of those operations. So the actual symbol grounding operation between language and math to the physical percepts and actions, I think, are not the same. I think the compositional framework is different, but the actual, the way in which you compose these things is similar. The actual abstraction operators are different, but the fact that you have abstraction operators is shared. So they may, have a common template for abstraction and composition and hierarchy, but the actual instantiation of those templates may differ.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And I think, the question of, do animals have this capacity? And I think, I think Nick really hit it in the head. So the idea of having a system of compositional operations that can be applied to what we might think of as sort of symbolic representations. I mean, I think sort of symbolic to the extent that they can be generalized and they're subject to these kind of common compositional operations. And that is you take one thing, you apply the operator, and it gives you another thing. And, do animals have that? I think they do have that capacity. So I think they have this sort of common substrate for kind of symbolic thinking. I think the idea of abstraction and the ability to kind of generalize and to take these compositional operators, move them from one domain into another domain, that, it's more complicated. I think they have the primitive structures for that. And I sort of like to think of the basic evolutionarily conserved structured brain structures that might subserve those functions that are kind of common in maybe language and mathematics, and also in sort of general animal problem solving. Hippocampus, the parietal cortex, frontal cortex, they're contributing to those functions. And so you can think of animals, they just, they can do these things, but they just don't do them very well. So you can think of animals, if you want to think of intelligence as the capacity to perform those functions, then animals have that. If you think of the scope of generalization, abstraction of those operations as a measure of, as Venki said, degree of intelligence, then yes, I think we have, we are more intelligent in that sense, and that there are individuals that have a greater capacity for that generalization, as Nick pointed out, and that may be something that can, that can actually be acquired through learning, through training. And I think a question of whether animals can be trained to do this is an open question. I think, sort of Laura's point that, animals, they can't generalize, between 9 and 10, 20 and 21, the equivalence of those. Well, humans don't do that very well either. I mean, humans are really terrible at doing that. In a sense, they know, but behaviorally, when you actually query them, they don't really express that, that they have all kinds of like screwed up scaling, temporal scaling, magnitude scaling, so that you could say, yeah, they understand the abstract concepts, but when you actually probe them behaviorally, they don't really express that very well. The problem with animals is we don't have good tests for that. We don't have good ways of actually measuring that beyond the kind of rudimentary behavioral test, which if we did this in a human, do they really have mathematical concepts? And I actually did the scaling. Look, I'll give you, I'll give you $1 today versus $100, 2 weeks from now. Do you know the difference between 1 and 100? And, they take the $1. You say, wait a minute, I don't, I don't understand. You don't seem to understand that 100 is worth more than 1. But if you actually scale that, you introduce like sort of, hyperbolic temporal scaling, they say, well, $1 today is worth more than $100, a year from now. In the same way, $10, the difference between, 10 and 20 is not the same as the difference between, $9.99 and, $1,099. People don't see a, $20 difference when the relative difference is small. So you think, yeah, 20 is 20.
Matt. let me break in a minute, because we should keep two things different, right? So temporal discounting and decision making, for sure. But if I give you a choice right now between a pile with 2 grapes and a pile with 3 grapes, and you like grapes, you'll choose the pile with 3 grapes, and so will many other creatures. But if I give you a pile, hold on, between 22 grapes and 23 grapes, you can do something other animals can't, which is you can count those, and you can decide that you want the 23 grapes. And most other creatures cannot. And that is a representation of number that most humans do have once they've learned our count list function, that I think really is distinctive, even though you're certainly right that there are lots of behavioral measures where we wouldn't display it. There are lots of cases where this cognitive technology that humans have is widely accessible and surprisingly distinctive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we, for instance, like, experiments that have been done with animals that seemingly are more intelligent, like, all the sort of the corvid experiments and the scrub jay experiments, where, they do seem to be able to both understand and express these concepts. Are they really smarter, or are they simply more capable of demonstrating, using the sort of behavioral assays that we have, that they have that capacity? I mean, are scrub jays really smarter than rats? I think probably not. Are they smarter than chickens? I mean, chickens, they get kind of a bum rap. If you keep chickens and you watch chickens, it's like they have very complex behavior, and you think they can't be that stupid. It's just they seem stupid because, we don't, we're not looking at intelligence in the same way. We're kind of measured by our kind of scalar intelligence rather than theirs. But that's I think that's a different question. I think the idea that there are different levels of intelligent capacity as, reflected in the ability to kind of abstract and generalize, I think that's perfectly reasonable. I don't think that we're as smart as chickens or as stupid. One or the other. It's
can I just say one point that I just so that I don't forget? I think Nicholas said that. I think I'm not sure I'm convinced that this analogy with sort of abstract math with any sort of language, any of the intelligence. I mean, math, formally is this idea of you have a set of axioms and you derive theorems based on these axioms. And I'm just not convinced, and obviously, you can correct me, that almost anything we do is anything more than approximations. I'm not sure that we really go through with, when you manipulate everything, that we kind of follow rules, even if in language. So I think the question perhaps is that, have we internalized some of these sort of axioms just from all the experience that we actually maybe don't even know, but we just have enough of the training examples and we just kind of go through it. And what looks overtly like we're manipulating some fundamental axioms to derive theorems is really just instantiations of lots of different combinations just from experience. And again, I'm happy to be corrected, but it seems like it's more of an approximation than a real axiom theorem.
So that's an interesting point, and I think I largely agree. And I guess what I would say is that most of us are operating at a relatively low level of abstraction that is absolutely approximate in the way that you describe. And I think as you get higher and higher in abstraction, then it becomes, the edges of the symbols become more and more precise, and fewer people, I think, are actually executing at that level. I also think the same thing is true of language to a large extent, is that like highly rarefied, even fiction is not as accessible as, sort of pulp fiction, as it were. And I think for the reasons you're pointing at.
Mm. Yeah, but I think maybe your argument, just to put on your side, is that the existence proof of some people who do exist in this kind of very abstract, very high level says that there's something about human brains, perhaps, that, I mean, I wonder too. I mean, music is another thing, right? I mean, I enjoy all kinds of music, and I really like kind of, mid 20th century music in an abstract level. There's all kinds of amazing formalism, but, it's just not enjoyable. But, there's lots of formalisms, and it's like, is there really now, what is that? I mean, is that axioms to
like Schoenberg and Alban Berg?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. And that's interesting because a lot of their music is derived from mathematical procedures, right?
Yes.
And yes, I appreciate that you appreciate it. I do not have as much of an appetite for it.
Although I think we should be, again, maybe because I think about how children learn fundamental concepts, but one of the things that's really striking is that something as simple as 2 or 5 is very abstract, right? Because when you think of 5, and you're a human and you really know what 5 is, which you do when you're about, 3 years old, you know that it's not just 5 grapes or 5 M&Ms or 5 cookies. It can be 5 minutes or 5 days or 5 utterances or 5 claps, right? It can apply to everything. So that doesn't have to be, modern contemporary music with deep abstract structure. That doesn't have to be postmodernist fiction. That's just 5, right? But it's abstract and it's symbolic and it's a concept, and it is very powerful, right? And
But
very
Laura, do you think,
corporeal.
sorry to interrupt, but do you think that it's been shown that animals don't have that you don't transfer from sort of 5 grapes to 5 pellets to 5 other
No,
creatures?
you never, for the reasons Matt suggested, you never want to bet against animals, because it's, there's always a possibility that maybe we weren't asking in the right way. Maybe we haven't come up with the simplest method. But a lot of work by a lot of folks, you have some existence proofs in gray parrots, right? Alex, that parrot, who could. But very many animals cannot. And the failures are surprising and shocking. And they're not that surprising and shocking, because you can also get really surprising, shocking failures from human children. So one of these very famous classic demonstrations is if you put 1 cookie in front of a kid in a box and 2 cookies in another box, they'll get 2 cookies in one. If you put 2 cookies in one box and 3 cookies in another, they'll get 3 cookies over 2. But if you put 4 cookies in one box and 1 cookie in another, they're at chance. And if you put 4 cookies in one box and 2 cookies in another, they're at chance. It's not about the ratio, it's about the absolute number. Until kids can count, they cannot track 4 objects any more than you can track 4 moving dots on a screen. They just drop it out entirely. So the ability, and those are 2-year-old kids, right? And it's not that they don't know or want more cookies. It's just that they can only do it with 1, 2, and 3. They can represent those exact numbers as object files. At 4, they can no longer do it because they can't count, right? So that's a human child who's going to learn to count, and they can't do it either. So there are lots of pretty stunning instances of failures that you don't get until you have these abstract representations.
Now, one point I just want to make, this is sort of these measures of animal intelligence. And another point that Nick brought up, I think is really important. And sort of it's this idea of exploration. And that is sort of the idea of evaluating outcomes that may not actually be optimal or may not actually reflect the problem that's being solved, and how important exploration is for intelligence, particularly as manifest in like groups. I mean, if you only solve the problem that you think you need to solve, you're not going to be able to respond adaptively when conditions change. And that really is how intelligence, in a kind of an evolutionary sense, is driven. And that is the ability to express adaptive behavior under changing contexts. So, and this idea of exploration, both behaviorally, but also when you kind of think of like the neural substrates, how do we actually think? What does, how does intelligence emerge? I think the idea that it involves in some way some kind of deep search, that we search some kind of problem space, we come to understand through that search how underlying representations might have some utility in optimizing that search, and that is the idea of symbolic representations and abstraction. And I think all of this comes from applying this process, like these generalizable compositional operators, in the context of some kind of larger search beyond immediate problem solving. So animals are trying to solve a bigger problem than the one you confront them with. And this often comes up even on like simple tasks. So you give an animal a simple task, like a little 2-arm maze, food on one side, no food on the other side, and ask it, just solve this simple task. And a lot of people point out, well, you give an animal this task, and monkeys, maybe they do like 90%, rat, they'll do like maybe 70%. So 70% of the time they go to the arm with the food, and then 30% of the time they're going to the arm that doesn't have any food. And you think, how stupid are these rats? Don't they get it? Food's on the right, not on the left. But now that's like this two-dimensional thinking. You're thinking what they're trying to solve is the problem you gave them, instead of they need to explore, they need to determine, has the problem changed? If I don't check out the left side, I'll never know whether perhaps the left side is actually now, is now optimal. And so they're trying to solve the broader problem, which is how do I adapt my behavior given the expectation that the problem will change? And so, thinking about, intelligence is when you express the optimal, response. You solve the problem well. I think animals often get shortchanged because they seem to be suboptimal in behavior, but only in the narrow task domain for which you actually put them. And I think, primates and humans, one thing that they're good at is sort of focusing on narrow problems. You ask them to solve a problem, they will solve that problem. Instead of, maybe kids are the same way. You want them to do one thing, they want to do other things. They're exploring, they're playing, they're trying to solve a broader problem. And so we think, well, that lack of focus is somehow diminished intelligence, when it may actually be the other way around.
This sort of goes to what I think Laura mentioned very early on. So I think, this old joke about you can always get to your optimization function based on integrating what the solution is, right? Going backwards. So if the utility function is something that you can kind of cook up whatever you want. So I think, it's like we have one particular function. So I think that's a fair point. I also want to point, one of the commenters said, should we move on to other questions? I don't know what people feel like, what the time constraint is, and if there are very specific questions that Chris or Gabriel want us to think about.
So we've got one submitted by Anonymous. Non-human primates have complex interactions and social structures which presumably require complex models of others' minds and communication. What do we think stops non-human animals from developing complex languages like us?
I mean, language is always a tough one, right? Because there's both the sort of the internal symbolic thinking, and that's necessary but not sufficient, right? I mean, language requires that we be able to, communicate that. And so distinguishing the thinking from the communication, and I think do animals have that ability? If they do, it's very limited. I mean, the combination of the two. I think sort of the underlying symbolic thinking, the substrate for language, is probably there, but
I think Laura probably should answer, but I thought that one of the kind of a physical constraint was really our structure of our larynx, like that there's really is some evolutionary development that is quite different from other non-human primates, the way our epiglottis and whatnot, that we really can create the output. I mean, I wonder how much that really is a constraint of expressing what one is
people
thinking.
Sign. I mean, they don't have to. It doesn't have to be a vocal.
I'm not sure if sign would have come before the vocal language. Maybe that's a theoretical question, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think language is, again, like intelligence itself, one of the perennial mysteries. Why do we have it? Why do other creatures don't? I think one of the interesting questions is, how much is it internal structural features of language, recursion, or the compositionality, versus how much is it more closely related to what we think of as motivational things, like an interest in communicating with our conspecifics, a desire to cooperate with them, and representation of their minds as potentially containing content that is different from ours, right? So if you assume that all your other members of your community know exactly what you know, there isn't a strong incentive to communicate anything. You only communicate, you usually communicate things because you think there's something in your mind that might not be present in the mind of another agent. Animals do, in a limited way, communicate. This is actually in a quite rich way. This is my territory. Go away. Right? These are. There's a predator nearby. They alarm about that, but you need comparatively rich sense of the possible things you might think about and might communicate about, even to want to express and communicate this. And I think it's an open question how much the absence of language and rich communicative systems in other animals is a constraint on the representation of the kind of knowledge you might have and lack, and when it might be present or absent in other creatures' minds versus the ability to manipulate a complex communicative system itself.
I largely agree with everything everybody said. The one thing that I wonder is, humans appear to have the ability to manipulate their environment more than most other animals. Like in some cases, animals exhibit, tremendously good skills with like tools, primates and even birds, et cetera. But I think overall, we obviously manipulate our environment considerably more than any other animal. That act of manipulating the environment and seeing the effects drives a lot of concepts that we wouldn't otherwise have or need to have. And so, Jacob Bernofsky, the anthropologist, has this wonderful turn of phrase that the hand is the cutting edge of the mind. And I wonder if one of the things that we have at our advantage is a morphology that lets us manipulate the environment a lot, which exposes to a lot more concepts that then drives the need for representation in a communication system. But I'm kind of talking out of my hat here. I don't know. I'm speculating wildly as to whether or not that's really true.
I think what Laura pointed out, at first I thought she was arguing that animals do have that capacity because, the sort of the need to communicate sophisticated concepts clearly, I think, is a part of animal communication. What seems to be lacking is this sort of the infinite generative capacity that you could say distinguishes language, and then the ability to communicate that. And so, when I think of if there is some sort of equivalence in the substrates for, for language, and that the infinite generative capacity for, let's say, symbolic introspection. And so I think of like navigation as being equivalent to that. Navigation is like that. There's an infinite generative capacity for like navigational trajectories. You give me any path to point A and point B, there's always going to be another route that you can think of that will get you that point. So you can think of like, language as like symbolic navigation. And so animals, you can say they have that capacity. They can think about, and plan, solve problems in space. What they can't do is they can't communicate that. They have very limited capacities. You can think about like, bees and their ability to communicate. It's very, that kind of communication, perhaps communicating discrete waypoints, other aspects of that underlying infinite generative capacity for sequential, symbolic evaluation, is they just can't communicate that. And so perhaps that's something that we've gained. We've gained the ability to take that, communicate that, and that's what distinguishes the language capacity, not the language substrate, or necessarily the let's say the social communicative imperative, which we both share. I mean, animals, they need to get along. They need to communicate complex state, complex motivations. They do that. They just don't do it with that very, let's say, that very specific and perhaps human limited capacity.
Yeah, this is interesting. So Laura and Matt, you both have pointed at and the question itself pointed to the fact that there are rich internal concepts that are just not being communicated. And so that the question is, so you might fall into the trap of thinking that animals or non-human primates can't generate the concept, but clearly they can. Like you both have given examples. So what is preventing that from getting translated into communication? That's a really interesting question. I have no idea.
Again, just to harp back on this kind of the degrees, I was just thinking a little bit about the waggle dance of bees. I mean, like, yes, it's very clear that there's communication of, the orientation and the angle and the distance to the source and whatnot. I'm curious now, like, how much variability is there? And is there some way of looking at sort of generative capabilities rather than just stereotyped, like there's only 2 bits of information, 3 bits of information versus something more? I mean, I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit, but it's also a little bit of the interpretability, going back to the overt expression of the intention, essentially, right? I mean, that's all we see in animals. And so I think it comes down to the capacity of, like, do we have it and can't express it? I'm just rephrasing what all of you said. Or you just don't have it, and therefore you don't express it.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a limited capacity to evaluate, to construct and evaluate the kind of constructions that underlie language. Now, are they really equivalent? I don't know. Because we don't have any way of actually measuring them, I think that it's not really sort of a meaningful distinction. I I think the fact that animals do not actually communicate that, and that's something that can be measured, you know, as Venki points out, like, you know, the waggle dance. I mean, these things that you can sort of operationally define and measure, how much information can they actually communicate about, let's say, like, you know, complex navigational solutions or strategies. Okay, we can measure that, and it's limited. And you could say, when we do this in humans, seemingly unlimited. We have this ability to, as we're demonstrating here, to speak, you know, forever on end. I mean, it's, you take a simple concept and you just go on forever. And animals just don't do that. Does that make us smarter than, I don't know. I mean, you
I think we're all thinking about colleagues that we know who go on forever.
I think there's, you know, there's value to being concise. It's right. Animals.
Giambattista asks, one thing that's missing in current AI is open-ended pondering. Most nets are feed-forward. Why is it so? And he has a little clarification. I meant the question to be about pondering, refining thoughts by investing more time and computation at the individual level.
Well, so there's a bunch of ways in which robots actually can do that. You know, when you have a size, weight, and power limited computer, you often prefer anytime algorithms, and there's several ways in which robots sometimes control their own speed as a function of the available computation and range, et cetera. You wouldn't necessarily call that pondering, but it has, certainly to your comment about refining thought by investing more time in computation, a lot of field systems do that all the time. Maybe we should call it pondering, I don't know. But I actually don't think that that is missing in AI. It might be missing from neural networks, but it's not missing from, you know, modular embodied intelligence.
I agree. And I think there was a question I noticed here, you know, where Patrick Winston, you know, he liked to think about our ability to tell stories as somehow being, you know, fundamental to intelligence. And he often asks the question, do rats tell stories? And I used to say to him, I believe that rats do tell stories. They just tell stories to themselves. And again, back to this language point, I think one of the abilities we've gained, we all tell stories. Rats and humans, we tell stories to ourselves, and that is, so we construct sort of our, you know, sort of internal narrative to explain and understand experience based upon some underlying model of the world, right? We take facts, we put them together so that they make sense. And what humans have gained is the ability to take those stories and to communicate, to tell stories to others. And so I think, again, this pondering, so I think of like pondering as this sort of internal evaluation, internal storytelling. This, you know, kind of thinking about trying to put things together.
Yeah. And so, Matt, I like from your work with like replay, like it's telling a story about the past, and then robots a lot of time do forward simulation, and so it's telling stories about the future.
I think of both. That is the storytelling. It's evaluating, sort of constructing a story that fits with that explains the past in order to predict the future. So once you have a story that works to explain the past, now you can use it to try to predict, you know, and guide the future.
And that's why fixed wing aircraft are so hard, is because they can't stop and ponder. Rotary wing aircraft can stop and think.
But I mean, I think Nick kind of alluded to it, the neural nets. I mean, I thought that one of the points of the, what was it, the Helmholtz machine that Terry and Jeff Hinton, it was the idea that, you know, you have this generative part of it, right? That you kind of ponder and generate something, and then you use that in the feed forward kind of a circuit. Anyway.
Yeah.
So the next one from Sophia, she's curious about what you all think about animal consciousness in the line of what Matt raised about having a correct assessment for animal intelligence. Is there a good test for self-awareness in animals? For example, most dogs cannot recognize themselves in the mirror, but they can recognize their own scent. Is the scent test a more appropriate test? And how could we test awareness in machines?
Wow, I'm gonna stay away from the consciousness question. I mean, that's just,
oh boy, this whole self-awareness mirror thing is crazy.
Well, self-awareness, I think it sort of points out this question. I think you have to operationally define it before you can start talking about it, right? And that's, I think, the problem. And I think, you know, the questioner gave, you know, good examples of how you might actually operationally define it in a way that might allow you to demonstrate it in certain animal capacities. You know, I think that, you know, we kind of think about consciousness in terms of, you know, our ability to you know, express through language what we're thinking. And obviously, if that's what it's about, animals don't have that, right? They can't tell us their stories. But if they could demonstrate, let's say, something like self-awareness, which is a, you know, sort of a much narrower definition, and they could do it through some, you know, very particular, you know, behavioral assay, I think you could argue, yes, they have that. They clearly have awareness of self, right? They have models and they think about, you know, themselves in the world.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to think about it as, you know, lots of creatures have models of the world. They have models of their own bodies in space, and then they might have models of their ability to make models, right? So they may have some metacognition, models of their own representations, and again, even in human children, you know, you get mirror self-recognition around 18 months, but you don't have autobiographical memory at 18 months, right? So children have some kind of self-awareness, but they don't have a continuous representation of themselves through time until much older, right? So there's degrees of representation, degrees to which we represent ourselves to ourselves, and those stories get elaborated. So I think it's an interesting question. You know, what do we mean by machine self-awareness, right? I think, you know, having machines that model their own models doesn't seem that far off. To what extent we would want to call that consciousness versus just a one more layer of an internal representation, I don't know. At some point, presumably, they will scale into each other.
I agree with that.
I also like models upon models. The thing that struck me, what you said, Laura, that's interesting is like from 18 to, I guess, do you get autobiographical memory at 3? Is that right?
On average, between 3. Most people's first reported memory will be around 3. Yeah.
So the size of the brain is growing substantially, and the available computation is much more. So I wonder if there's a relationship between the amount of computation a device has and its ability to model itself and model its own models. Because that's a, you know, from a purely sort of like, you know, in silicon perspective, that's a very expensive operation. And that's a reason why a lot of robots don't have it, is because it's hard to implement, or most in silicon intelligences don't have it because it's really, really hard to do, and it's really, really compute expensive.
Who knows with you, right? So, I mean, again, children have self-conscious emotions much before that. They can be proud and they can be embarrassed. They can recognize themselves in mirrors long before they have autobiographical memory. So representing yourself through time, I think, may be a you know, particularly late development. And, you know, we're so energy efficient compared to machines. You know, we run basically on, you know, children seem to run on Cheerios. So compared to what it takes to run GPT-3 these days. So I think it's hard to know what will be computationally expensive instantiated in human brains.
But it's also the development of the human brain is pretty heterogeneous, right? It's not that the entire brain is developing, and some parts are pretty mature at 5 and some parts are completely not mature. So I think, you know, it seems a little bit tricky to say that it's some overall connectivity matrix versus, you know, more specific regional things.
Yeah, and I also think it's the concept of autobiographical memory. I think that we certainly, yeah, if we go back to storytelling, I always like to say, you know, all memory is false memory. I mean, we think that we actually have this capacity to remember what happened, but what we really do is we have the ability to actually to tell stories about what has happened, and we sort of build a model that's sufficiently consistent that it can be applied to explain things in the past. But often, those explanations are inaccurate. They're consistent, but inaccurate. And so I think, you know, one of the difficulties that we have in evaluating autobiographical memory in, let's say, young children is that basically the model has changed. The model is, and so we simply don't have a model of a 3-year-old. By the time we can actually interrogate the memories that might have been present, and the model might have been consistent, the stories might have been there and being told, it's just that we don't understand how to tell those stories, you know, the story of a 3-year-old when we're 6. And so I think that capacity does exist at that time, We, just like with animals, we don't have the ability to interrogate it because they can't articulate what they're actually thinking about. And then by the time they can articulate it, the model has changed sufficiently. They've gained all these other abilities, you know, sort of language and the way in which you think about things just no longer has the ability to express that. So you just can't tell that story anymore. But, you know, to Nick's point, you know, the basic substrates are there. They do develop, and you think about the hippocampus as being kind of central to this ability to both kind of capture, express, and evaluate these like episodic events. The autobiographical component of memory, you think, is having that essential hippocampal component. Well, it's there. I mean, it does continue to develop, but it's still there. And so I wouldn't say, oh yeah, you know, you're not conscious until you're 3 or 4 or 5. You know, just like I wouldn't say, oh yeah, you know, rats are not conscious.
But to the extent, Matt, that we buy the I don't know, the hypothesis, maybe too strong a word, the idea that, you know, hippocampal PFC, prefrontal interactions, are somehow particularly important for doing all these manipulations, and that develops much later. So for humans, it's possible that, yeah, sure, you can do all the
it develops, you know, you know, it becomes more robust.
I know.
It's not that it's not there, right? It's there, it just becomes more robust. And so, yeah, there's a greater capacity. And just as there's a greater capacity in, let's say, humans relative to, let's say, rodents. Yes, rodents have the same basics, you know, they have the same structures, the substrates, the connections. It's just not as much of it. So it's this capacity issue that Nick raised. Yeah, I think that there is a difference in capacity, but unless you want to use like some kind of sort of scale or threshold for consciousness, yeah, if you have, you know, whatever you want to call it, G, right? So much of it, okay, you cross the threshold, yes, you have it. Below the threshold, no, you don't have it. That doesn't seem that useful. I mean, it might make us feel better, but I don't think it's really that. I don't think it's useful. Largely because I think if you think about it in the continuum, it's not so much, you know, falling below that. It's what happens when you actually go beyond that, when you extend that. And so I think it's, you know, it's better to think of like an expanded consciousness. That is, what does it mean to be able to incorporate a much larger scope of models into, you know, your sort of framework of abstraction? That's, I think, what we sort of hope and imagine that, or fear that, you know, synthetic AI is going to be capable of.
I go back to, I think I was just browsing through the questions to go back to, I think maybe Laura's point. I think somebody pointed out that, like, why are humans able to, and why is it useful to do in a 22 versus 23? Like, and is this some epiphenomena of some other thing that we kind of developed, or is it really that we really need these kinds of counting ability? And as somebody pointed out, like, you know, a goat eating leaves, it doesn't matter if they eat like 3 leaves or a few leaves, right? So I'm now, it got me curious. Do you think that this is just sort of a side thing of some other larger symbol manipulation thing?
Well, I think, I mean, we can return to Matt's point, right? So obviously the ability to build richer and richer models of the world, there's probably no human ability that's more powerful than abilities that start with the ability to distinguish 22 and 23, right? Like mathematical models of the world have been what has given human beings the capacity to manipulate environment beyond the capacity of any other organism, right? And right now they're allowing us to create and ask questions about other forms of intelligence and artificial intelligence. So part of what is interesting about humans is, again, you know, what's useful? Well, we have the ability, obviously animals survive and thrive and have for millennia without any need for this. We have the ability to develop capacities that go and create problems that go far beyond what might seem like the simple evolutionary requirements, and then just turned out to be incredibly powerful for our species and let us fill a very distinctive adaptive niche. And that is kind of the remarkable signature of human intelligence, is, you know, how much richer our models are than they would seem to need to be. merely to eat and survive.
Yep. I mean, part of me, I was just thinking maybe this is a false analogy that, you know, there's sort of the issue of resolution, right? I mean, if you're thinking of, for example, visual resolution, you know, just having finer and finer visual and an angle is good for maybe an eagle that's hunting, right? I mean, there's a very specific need. So I'm wondering if our thing is just somehow a higher resolution for some symbolic manipulation. Right? I mean, this is just it's not a sensory perception thing, but some other more abstract thing, and we're getting finer and finer and resolving. Yeah. Maybe it's an imperfect analogy.
So let me thank all the panelists. I think this was a very fun discussion.
It's fun.
And also all the attendees as well. And we will continue. I wish everybody a very nice weekend, and we will continue on Monday at noon. Okay, thank you very much.